The sky was too clear for heartbreak. Sunlight spilled mercilessly across the chapel steps as Marin clutched her dress in trembling hands. The satin already damp with sweat and nerves. Her lace sleeves dug into her arms. Too tight, never quite made for her shape. But she'd worn them anyway, because this was supposed to be her day. Her moment. But even before she reached the chapel door, she could hear them. They didn't even try to whisper. She would think later, replaying it all. Their voices rose like knives tossed on laughter. She'll break the pew. Hope the floorboards hold. Is that her veil or the church curtain? Each comment pierced a different part of her. Her cheeks burned hotter than the rouge she'd dabbed on with a shaky hand that morning. Her bouquet trembled in her grip, petals bruising with each passing second. Inside, her groom, Seth, stood still as stone. Not once had he come to greet her. Not once had he offered his arm. His eyes stayed locked on the floor, as if seeing her might crack whatever resolve he'd built. She reached for the church handle. It wouldn't budge. At first, she thought it might be stuck. Some mechanical accident, until a voice, muffled but unmistakably cruel, came from behind the door. A deacon. We won't have her make a mockery of the Lord's house. This wedding is off. No explanation, no confrontation, just rejection. As final as the clang of a coffin lid. Marin froze, the bouquet slipping from her fingers and hitting the steps with a muted thud. Behind her, the side doors creaked open. Guests, some of them family. Some she'd known since she was a child, began to shuffle out in clusters, trying not to meet her eyes. A few didn't bother hiding their smirks. Some whispered behind gloved hands. Others simply looked through her, like she had never been there at all. She could still hear someone mutter, "Well, he dodged a cow-sized bullet." Her heart fractured in silence. Her uncle came to her side then, not with comfort, but urgency. He gripped her arm and muttered something about leaving quickly. About dignity. But what dignity did she have left? Everything, the years of swallowing pride, of shrinking herself in every possible way to fit into a world that never wanted her, had unraveled in mere minutes. And Seth, he hadn't even stopped it. He had stood at the altar, said nothing, had let the doors lock, had let the crowd mock, had let her walk up the steps of a house of worship only to be turned away like she was an unclean thing. Shame flushed through her in waves. Hot, blistering, paralyzing. It wasn't just the rejection. It was how they did it. There had been no private conversation, no quiet moment of truth, no hard but honest confession. They'd turned her away like a joke, like she was a problem someone forgot to fix. They didn't see her as a woman in love, as someone nervous and radiant and hopeful. They saw a body, a size, a spectacle. She felt too big for the steps, too loud for the silence, too much in every way, and yet, too invisible to be defended. Hours passed, but she didn't leave. The sun had long slipped behind the horizon. The lights inside the chapel were out. The laughter had faded from the town square. Still, Marin sat at the back of the church, her dress torn at the hem, her veil tossed beside her like forgotten lace. Her lipstick had faded, her shoes pinched, her throat was raw from swallowing every scream, every plea. Why wasn't I enough? She wanted to scream. Why did no one fight for me? The hardest part wasn't the wedding being cancelled. It wasn't even the whispers or the smirks. The hardest part was that she'd believed she was finally going to be chosen. That maybe, just maybe, someone could love her as she was. And in the end, they couldn't even look her in the eye when they pushed her aside. She pressed her forehead to her knees, trying to disappear, but even then, she knew, there was no place small enough to hide from the pain of being rejected for simply existing. And worst of all, some part of her had expected this. Not in words, not in plans, but in the deep ache that had lived in her chest for years, the one that always whispered she was too much. That if love came at all, it would come conditionally, reluctantly, shamefully. And now, that voice had been proven right. The pain wasn't theatrical. It wasn't poetic. It was ugly, dull, humiliating. It settled into her bones like cold rain, made her shiver even though the night was warm. She was a bride undone, not by tragedy, but by contempt disguised as tradition. That was the cruelest part. It wasn't just about a man who didn't love her. It was about a town that had never believed she was worth being loved in the first place. The stars had begun to emerge, one by one, pricking the velvet sky with silver light. Marin sat motionless on the chapel steps, her dress torn at the hem, her hands raw from gripping sorrow too tightly. The bouquet she'd dropped hours earlier lay nearby, wilted and bruised, but somehow still holding its shape, just like her. The shame hadn't faded, the sting of rejection still sat heavy in her bones. But the tears had never come. It was as if the weight of humiliation had dried them out before they could fall. She wasn't sure how long she'd been sitting there, only that the world had grown quieter, softer in its cruelty, now that everyone had left. And then she heard boots. Steady, measured, not rushed, not hesitant, just present. She didn't lift her head right away. For all she knew, it could be another townsperson coming to deliver another slice of pity wrapped in scripture. But something about the pace of those footsteps stilled the ache in her chest. When she finally looked up, she saw a man she barely knew. Calder Shaw, a cowboy, quiet and broad-shouldered, the kind of man you noticed more by his stillness than by his voice. She remembered passing him once or twice in town, always alone. Always polite, never lingering long enough to be questioned. Now, he stood a few feet away, hat in one hand, bouquet in the other, the same one she had dropped. Crumpled but intact. "You dropped this," he said, voice low and even. Marin blinked. "Why'd you come?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. He hesitated before answering, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to say it right. "I was there," he said. "I heard them, but I saw something else." She stared at him. "I saw someone stand taller than anyone in that room, just for walking alone." That broke something in her. Not all at once, not loud, just a soft crack in the dam she'd built around her heart. Calder knelt, reached into his coat, and pulled out a small tin box. He held it out to her. Inside, a biscuit. "My ma used to say, if you don't know what to say, feed someone first. I'll sit with you, if that's all right." She didn't answer, just nodded, and he didn't sit close. Just enough to share the silence. No questions, no speeches, no pity, only presence. Marin broke off small pieces of the biscuit, letting them melt on her tongue. The warmth didn't come from the food, it came from the stillness Calder brought with him. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty. It was full, steady, safe. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The chapel loomed behind her like a tomb, its locked door a memory she didn't want to touch. But in front of her, Calder remained, cross-legged in the dirt, his hat resting on one knee, his eyes on the horizon like he had nowhere more important to be. "You can go," she said eventually, voice tight. "I'm not some lost calf needing rescue." He nodded. "Didn't figure you were." And still, he didn't leave. That, more than anything, undid her. She studied him under the moonlight. Rough face, clean eyes, not young, not old, a man carved from labor and silence. A man who saw her, not as a burden or a punchline, but as someone worth waiting with. "Why do you care what happened to me?" she asked. He shrugged. "I know what it's like to be locked out of places, to be told you don't belong. Even when you should." Those words landed hard. "They said I was too big for a church," she whispered. "Too much woman for one man." Calder looked at her then. Steady. Or maybe too much woman for a coward. She didn't expect the laugh that broke from her, short, wet, startled. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, surprised to find moisture there. "You always talk like that?" "Only when I mean it." The silence after that wasn't heavy. It was gentle, like a blanket laid over an aching body. "Where do you sleep?" she asked. "Wagons by the creek." "Alone?" "Always, by choice, until now." He stood, stretched a little, then looked down at her, not with pity, but with something almost like reverence. "If I came back tomorrow," he said slowly, "and asked you to walk again, not to a church, not for anyone else, just beside me, would you consider it?" Marin didn't answer. She just closed her fingers around the tin box he'd given her. She wasn't ready to stand. Not yet. But something in her legs remembered how. "You come back tomorrow," she said, "and maybe I will. Blank. Blank. He did. The next morning, dew still clinging to the grass. Marin found a warm tin coffee pot and a biscuit wrapped in a handkerchief beside her. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't waited to be seen. He'd just left kindness behind. Like a letter folded under a door. No demands. No expectations. And when she saw him later that day, riding slow from the east, reins loose in one hand and a wool cloak in the other, Marin felt something in her chest shift. He offered it to her without a word. "You looked cold," he said. "No conditions. No hesitation. Just care." "You always bring gifts to women left at the altar?" she asked. "Just the ones worth picking up." She smirked. "I know what you meant." And for the first time in what felt like forever, her smile wasn't fake. It wasn't forced. It was real. Calder didn't save her. He walked with her. And in the days that followed, raising beams, lighting fires, hauling water, they built more than a cabin. They built a kind of peace Marin had never known. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, and finally, safe. The hardest part wasn't surviving the shame. It was choosing to show up again. After the chapel doors had closed on her and the whispers had stained her name like wine on linen, Marin could have vanished, could have built a life far from the people who saw her as too much, too wide, too loud, too strange for grace. But she didn't leave. Instead, she returned, not for their approval, and not to plead for space. She returned because she realized the only way they would ever truly see her was if she made herself unmissable. It began with the church. One Sunday, weeks after the would-be wedding, Marin stood once again at the foot of those same steps where she'd been humiliated. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from memory. The dress she wore wasn't new, but it was clean, pressed, simple, her hair tied back with a piece of blue ribbon Rosa Elcott had given her just because. No veil this time, no fanfare, just Marin, as she was. As she pushed open the chapel doors, the room paused. Heads turned. The murmur of conversation faltered. But Marin didn't shrink. She didn't search for a pew at the back. She walked straight down the aisle, her back straight, chin high, and sat beside Calder, who simply nodded like she had just come home. The preacher, to his credit, smiled mid-sermon and welcomed her with a glance. And not a single soul whispered when the pew creaked beneath her. And when the oldest woman in town, Mrs. Tross, leaned over after the service and said, "You have a strong walk, child," Marin nearly wept, not because of pity, but because, for once, it sounded like respect. It didn't stop there. The autumn pie social came next. Marin never intended to enter. Baking had always been something she did for herself, quietly, on nights when the world felt too heavy. But Rosa insisted, showing up 2 days before the contest with a sack of apples and a grin that dared her to try. "If you don't enter, Miss Crystal's going to win again," Rosa said, and I can't survive another year of her pecan smugness. So Marin peeled and sliced. Her hands steady, her mind surprisingly calm. She didn't measure, just felt her way through the crust like her mother taught her, by instinct. Not perfection. When she brought the pie to the churchyard in a borrowed basket, her heart thudded like it might break through her chest. Tables overflowed with golden meringues, sugary cobblers, glossy custards. Marin's apple pie, rustic and humble, sat quietly at the edge, like it wasn't sure it belonged. Most passed by, but then the mayor's wife took a bite. She stopped, then took another, and before long, a crowd had gathered, not around Marin, but around her pie. People began asking whose recipe it was. Someone said it tasted like memory. The mayor's husband called over a judge. And when they finally announced Marin's name as the winner, the applause that followed wasn't roaring, but it was real. Some clapped out of politeness, some out of surprise. But Rosa whooped so loudly the mountains surely heard her. And Calder, standing a few feet back, just tipped his hat. Calm and proud. Later, Delilah cornered her near the cider stand. Her lips curled. "You really think pie makes you one of us?" Marin didn't flinch, didn't fire back. "No," she said simply, "but kindness might." And that was that. The whispers didn't stop overnight. But they changed, shifted, lost their bite. Then came the harvest dance. Marin had no intention of going. She had no dress, no dance shoes, and certainly no desire to be laughed at on the dance floor. But Rosa showed up again, this time with determination and 2 mugs of warm cider. "If you don't dance," she said, "then neither will I. We'll just stand and pretend to like music." Marin laughed, then hesitated. But that night, she found herself standing in the corner of the church hall, watching others swirl past in ruffles and silk, their laughter floating like ribbons. She had just turned to leave when Calder appeared, sleeves rolled, suspenders loose, dirt on his boots from the day's work. "I was hoping I'd find you here," he said. "You don't strike me as the dancing type," she replied, caught off guard. "I ain't," he admitted, "but I figure neither of us has to be good at it to enjoy it." He held out his hand. She stared. The room blurred for a moment, the past tightening around her like an old corset. Then she took it. They moved slowly, awkwardly at first. Her boots scuffed the floor. She didn't twirl, she didn't float, but she danced, with her shoulders straight, her body proud, her heart steadied by the man who never once asked her to be smaller. And something happened. The room didn't laugh. It watched. People paused, not with malice, but with something quieter, surprise. Perhaps curiosity, even awe. Delilah, standing at the edge with her arms crossed, didn't look away. As the last note of the fiddle drifted away, Calder leaned in. "You still think you don't belong?" She swallowed. "I still think it's not easy. Nothing worth it ever is," he said. "But you're worth it." And she believed him. For the first time, she truly believed him. They walked home under the stars, her boots slung over her shoulder, her bare feet kissing the cool earth. And though no crown adorned her head, Marin felt, deep in her bones, that she'd just been named queen of something far more sacred than any ceremony could offer. Herself. There were no bells, no music, no flower-strewn aisle, but the air smelled like cedar and fresh morning light, and Marin couldn't remember ever feeling more at peace. The day of the wedding arrived not with fanfare, but with dew. The valley was hushed in the early gold of dawn, the kind of stillness that feels like reverence. Birds hadn't yet broken into song. The wheatgrass shimmered under the sun's first glance, and somewhere nearby, the creek whispered against stone. Calder didn't wear anything new, just his cleanest shirt, sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows, the fabric worn soft from years of sun and sweat. Marin wore the dress Leia had given her, the simple, hand-stitched one that had been waiting on the shelf for a bride brave enough to wear it. It wasn't pure white, but a creamy hue softened by time. A button was missing from the collar. But she didn't care. It fit her without asking her to shrink. That was enough. They met beneath a cedar tree, the same one Calder had cleared a space under weeks earlier, pounding a few humble planks into a small platform just big enough for two. No one had been invited. But people came, not because they were asked, but because something in the town had begun to shift. It wasn't overnight, but little by little. After seeing Marin carry firewood through town, watching her dance at the harvest social, and tasting the pie that had won hearts more than ribbons, the community began to unlearn the cruelty it once wore so casually. So they came, not to judge, not to whisper, but to witness. Mrs. Tross came with a quilt folded under her arm. Rosa Elcott came with a bouquet of fresh wildflowers. Even the preacher, Calder's uncle, a man who rarely used more words than necessary, stood beside the platform with a small weathered Bible, nodding like all of this had been decided long ago in some place beyond words. There were no pews, just dirt and grass and soft eyes. When Marin stepped onto that platform, no one giggled, no one looked away. The same woman who had once been mocked outside a locked church door now stood tall. Her chin lifted, her back straight, her hands steady in Calder's. The wind picked up as if it had waited for this moment, rustling the tree limbs above them like gentle applause. "What God shapes," the preacher said, "no man can mock." Calder didn't look nervous. He didn't stumble over his vows. He looked at her like he was home. But it was Marin's voice that silenced the earth. "I once believed I was too much," she said, voice quiet but unshaking. "Too loud, too big, too different to be loved. But then I learned, my strength wasn't a burden. It was a gift, waiting to be seen." She turned fully to Calder now, her eyes damp but proud. "And you saw it, not after I changed, not after I begged, but exactly as I was." He smiled, wide and soft, and for a second, the valley seemed to exhale. When they kissed, no one clapped, no one shouted. They didn't need to. The moment held its own sacred rhythm. Afterward, guests lingered around a long wooden table set beneath the trees. There was no wine, just cold cider and bread passed hand to hand. Marin had made stew that morning with Rosa's help. Enough to feed anyone who showed. Children ran barefoot through the tall grass, their laughter weaving between the grown-ups' conversations. Someone played a harmonica, someone else sang half a song and forgot the words. Nobody minded. No speeches, no elaborate centerpieces, no seating charts, just connection. One neighbor clinked their tin mug and asked how Marin had gotten her sourdough so soft. Another passed her a small wrapped package, homemade jam, labeled for your new home. Someone else gave her a weathered horseshoe. For luck. Calder took it all in silently. But his hand never left hers. Not once. No one brought up the past. No one mentioned what had happened at the church. Because in the presence of something true, shame has no place. And this was true. Later that evening, when the guests had gone and only embers glowed in the fire pit, Marin and Calder sat on the porch of their still unfinished cabin. Wrapped in a shared blanket, the stars blinked overhead, coyotes howled faintly in the distance, and the scent of pine drifted softly in the air. Marin leaned against Calder's shoulder and asked, just above a whisper, "Did you know it would feel like this?" Calder looked down at her. Quiet as always. "No," he said. "I just knew I wanted it with you." She smiled, tired and warm and full. "It wasn't fancy," she said. "It wasn't ever going to be." "Didn't want fancy," he replied. "Wanted honest." Got it. And in the gentle hush of that night, with no veil, no aisle, and no validation from people who'd once looked through her, Marin knew. She didn't need permission to be a bride. She didn't need approval to be loved. She had found something better, a life built with bare hands, chosen hearts, and the kind of love that didn't need an audience to be real. She rested her head on Calder's chest as the fire crackled low, the embers glowing like little stars at their feet. Not long after, he fell asleep, but she stayed awake for a while longer, just listening, to the wind, to the night, to the peace that had finally come home to stay. It had taken time, more than she liked to admit. Time to scrape shame from the marrow of her bones. Time to stand, not just with feet planted, but with her head lifted high. But one morning, as sunlight poured over the porch and wildflowers curled at the edge of the field, Marin stood proud. Not proud because of praise, not because of applause, but because she no longer needed either. The dress she wore that day wasn't stitched by designers or bought with fanfare. It was the one Laia had gifted her months ago. Still simple, still slightly faded at the hem. But it hugged her body like it had been waiting for this version of her, the woman who no longer apologized for how much space she took up in the world. Marin didn't walk quickly through town anymore. Didn't duck her head when voices rose behind her. She walked with purpose, not loud. Not boastful, but rooted. People noticed. Not with the side eyes they used to give. Not with whispers sharpened by cruelty. Now, they stepped aside respectfully. Some nodded, others smiled. Rosa, breathless and late as always, once shouted across the street, "Marin, you forgot your jam," in full view of everyone. And Marin just laughed, full-throated and bright, without shrinking. Without wondering who was watching. The town had learned something over the seasons. You cannot keep a woman small once she remembers her worth. They'd tried. Years of side comments, silent judgment, tight-lipped invitations, but she had outlived their ridicule. Had stood straighter, spoken clearer, worked harder than any of them ever expected. When she passed the church now, the same one that once closed its doors on her, the memory no longer dragged her shoulders down. It still lived inside her, but not as pain. As proof. Proof that she had survived their cruelty and come out unbent. And that mattered more than any ceremony they'd once denied her. Blank. One afternoon, Marin found herself walking past Miss Laia's shop. The bell above the door rang as she entered. The same way it had when she'd first seen the forgotten wedding dress months earlier. But this time, she wasn't there for fabric or thread. She was there for threadbare truth. Laia looked up, startled. "You're glowing," she said, not sarcastic, not teasing, just honest. "I feel like myself," Marin replied. And it was true. She no longer measured her value in the eyes of others. no longer traced her worth against the outlines of smaller women or the shallow acceptance of a man who had once turned away from her. Calder had never asked her to be anything but herself. And more importantly, she had stopped asking herself to be less. Blank. Blank. At the next church gathering, Marin wore the dress again. Not because she wanted to impress, but because it reminded her of how far she'd come. She stepped through the door not as someone seeking a seat, but as someone claiming space. People didn't whisper. They moved aside. They made room. And when the preacher smiled from the pulpit and said, "Glad to see you again, Marin," she didn't blush. She nodded, calm, centered. During the final hymn, a little girl 2 pews down turned to her and whispered, "You look like a storybook queen." Marin smiled gently. "I am," she said, "but I wrote the story myself." Blank. Back at home, the cabin stood taller now, fully finished. A coat of fresh whitewash gleaming in the sun. Calder had planted wildflowers near the porch. Marin had built shelves in the kitchen with her own hands. Their life was stitched together from effort, trust, and a kind of love that didn't ask for performance. That night, as they sat by the fire, Calder handed her a small box carved from pine. Inside was a wooden ribbon he'd shaped himself. On it were the words, "You were never too much." She held it like it was gold. "I knew that once," she said softly. "Then I forgot. Then the world tried to erase it altogether. But you remembered," Calder replied. "I did." She nodded. "And I'll never forget again." Blank. The next week, Marin stood in front of the schoolhouse reading aloud from a book to a group of children. Not because anyone asked her. Just because Rosa had joked one afternoon, "You tell stories better than the preacher." And a handful of kids had asked her to come read. She didn't wear makeup. Her hands were calloused from working with wood. Her voice was steady, confident. One of the girls looked up after the story ended and asked, "Were you ever scared to talk out loud?" Marin paused. "Yes," she said, "but I did it anyway." Blank. She had become something the town didn't know how to name. A woman who hadn't earned respect by becoming smaller, quieter, or thinner, but by refusing to hide. By existing without apology. And in doing so, she had become a mirror for others who'd spent their lives making themselves small to fit into spaces never made for them. Marin never needed a stage or applause. She just needed a place. And now, she had it. A cabin built with steady hands. A husband who saw her. Always. A name written into the church book without condition. A community that now respected her. Not because she changed, but because she stayed true. And a heart that beat fully, not behind armor, but in open air. When people spoke of her now, it wasn't with mockery. It was with recognition. They said, "That's Marin. Not the big one. Not the left at the altar one. Just Marin. Strong, capable, whole." And when she passed, head high, shoulders back, smile easy, they didn't just move aside. They followed her lead.